When you think about slavery, you're likely going to picture the transatlantic slave trade. This was started by the Europeans in the 16th century and is probably the most documented of occurrences related to slavery. However, there are truths that remain untold about slavery, dating back not just to earlier centuries, but even to ancient times. I'm talking about the Arab slave trade. When we look at ancient history, there was a time when the Arabs became involved in slave trading, long before the Europeans initiated it. Yet, this isn't the type of history lesson you're taught when asking questions about where slavery came from.
Ancient Egypt had slaves toiling away in its fields and on its monuments. Ancient Carthage trafficked in slaves across the Mediterranean.
In this video, we take a deep dive into the truth about Arab slave trade. We'll look at the role that civilizations like the Egyptians played in slavery and how they actually started several routes that continue to serve the purpose of transporting slaves for centuries. The slavery we are taught about in modern day refers mostly to the transatlantic slave trade. This slave trade lasted for 400 years, starting in the 16th century. By the 19th century, Black people were able to fight for their freedom, and slavery came to an end. The Arab slave trade, one that many people fail to discuss when talking about slavery, actually lasted much longer compared to the transatlantic slave trade. Today, we call it the Trans-Saharan slave trade, and it lasted for about 1,300 years, with brutality that often goes untold. In fact, this particular slave trade was still active after slavery was abolished in America during the 19th century. The trading of slaves in the Arab world extended into the 20th century before it was completely abolished. The truth is, we tend to immediately picture the Europeans when we talk about slavery. Yet Arabs and Muslims played a role in the slave trade much earlier than the Europeans. So let's take a look at how it started, who was involved, and see what really happened during the Trans-Saharan slave trade. We'll also go even further down history to see where slavery truly started in Egypt. Let's start with records that actually go back to ancient times in Egypt. The first records that have been recovered by scientists and researchers date slavery back to about the 3rd millennium BC. This was the time when Senefru was king of Egypt. Records have shown that Senefru actually crossed what was known as the Nile's Fourth Cataract in order to capture people in the area, who would then become the property of the king. Once captured, the king of Egypt sent these individuals north. The area where Senefru started to capture people for enslavement is known as Sudan today. What started out as recruiting soldiers for war ended up as slavery later on. Senefru would get people from across the Nile to fight in his war, and they would end up being slaves later. It became something very common in the ancient Nile Valley area, as well as within Africa. The king's main targets for slavery were the ancient Nubians. The ancient Egyptians took them in as slaves and would then sell them to merchants from other areas of the world. It wasn't just the Egyptians who relied on slavery, however. For the Garamantes, documents show that there was also heavy reliance on slave labor that came from the sub-Saharan African regions. The Garamantes, believed to be related to the Berbers, used these slaves to assist with the construction of Foggara, a type of underground irrigation system.
1st and 2nd centuries. We hear little of the Garamantes in post-Roman times.
Records from Herodotus, an ancient Greek historian, also describe how the Garamantes chased the Troglodytae, who were also known as cave-dwelling Ethiopians, with chariots in the 5th century BC. The Arab slave war extended to areas away from Egypt. Records even show an established slave market within Lepsus, an ancient city in the Roman Empire. This also dates back to around the 5th century BC, where they would capture and then sell Bantu Africans within this trade market. During this time, Black individuals were considered exotic, particularly due to their appearance. This made them popular among those who were looking for a household slave. The Black slaves would have to take up tasks provided to them by their owners. Experts have also found that the slave trade market significantly increased when the Berbers and the Arabs decided to introduce many camels in the areas that were covered with deserts. This made it easier for slaves to be transported to different areas, including several established slave markets where merchants and even residents could come when they wanted to own or trade slaves.
The journey across the desert was of course absolutely brutal, and many Africans perished along the way.
What we do know is that there were far more African slaves in the Arab slave market compared to the Roman Empire. Experts have concluded this based on the fact that black slaves were viewed as exotic within the early Roman Empire. This means they must have been rarer compared to other areas where it was common for people to have owned black slaves. Records show that the trans-Saharan slave trade began in antiquity, but still continued to be active in the Middle Ages. Some experts have weighed in on the potential number of black slaves who were transported through the Sahara during this time. According to one expert, the number is about 6 million, particularly from 650 AD to 1500 AD. However, some believe that there were several million more black slaves transported through the Sahara during this time. This is also where the violence comes into the picture. Arabs had different ways to capture black Africans that would then become part of their slave market. However, a common way for the Arabs to do so was through violent raids. These raids allowed Arabs to capture black people in the lower parts of Africa. The black slaves would then be forced to march through the Sahara Desert and make their way to slave markets. Once these people arrived at slave markets, they were treated like property. People were able to buy and sell them. Their humanity was stripped away from them, and they had to obey their owners to avoid meeting violence or even worse in some cases. The Arabs established slave markets in various areas across North Africa. The major ones were found in Cairo, Tripoli, Algiers, and Morocco. Things get even worse when we consider the fact that black people eventually started to turn on their own kind. These were tough, violent, and dangerous times. Arabs didn't always have to raid areas in order to capture black people to become slaves. Some black rulers, who were local in areas throughout Africa, would actually sell their own people to the Arabs to become slaves. Yaqubi, a 9th century Arab historian, was also found to say that he heard about kings selling blacks without any war or pretext. This record shows how black kings eventually started to turn on their own, selling black people who were part of their own communities. It could have been to save the area from war. Several others have also testified, such as Ibn Khaldun.
Ibn Khaldun testifies to the presence of large slave populations in the 14th century in North Africa, when he wrote that the blacks constituted the ordinary mass of slaves.
Records show that as the Arab slave trade continued, very few Africans in the sub-Saharan regions decided to resist the idea. They would be met with violence. Village kings and chiefs became middlemen in this entire slave trafficking system. They had to get members from villages close by and then sell them to merchants who came to them. By the 16th century, the Arabs decided to expand both the Nile River and the Saharan slave routes. This caused them to enter Central Africa, where they continued to perform raids throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. As the transatlantic slave trade came to an end in the 19th century, the same cannot be said for the sub-Saharan Arab slave trade. The Arabs continued to raid local villages, bring harm to black people in Central Africa, and send them to slave markets where they would be sold. In the 19th century alone, it's estimated that about 1.2 million slaves were transported through the Sahara. Slaves were treated harshly by their owners. In one case, G.F. Lyon recorded their views and experiences seeing these slaves. When a slave died, the owner would often find themselves with a regret of not using a red-hot iron to burn the belly of the slave. This shows just how these slaves were treated by their owners and the suffering they had to endure after being captured in their own homeland. While there's often a large focus on the Europeans who engaged in slave trading, we should not overlook earlier forms of slavery. The Arabs initiated what was known as the Trans-Saharan slave trade, moving black people from sub-Saharan Africa toward the north, where they were then sold to civilizations in the Middle East and the Mediterranean regions. This slave trade period lasted over 1,000 years and continued to be active even when the transatlantic slave trade was abolished.